The Ottoman Empire was not destroyed only on the battlefield. It was destroyed by economic crisis, by trade agreements that seemed rational on paper, a financial trap that took centuries to escape, and by the time someone realized it, there was no way out. It all begins in 1536, not with a war, with a handshake. The Ottoman Empire at this point holds enormous power. It stretches from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, from North Africa to the Black Sea, wealthy, powerful, and controlling a large portion of the world's most important trade routes. When France requested special trade privileges, lower customs tariffs, legal exemptions, open access to Ottoman markets, the Sultan agreed. At that moment, it looked like a clever diplomatic move, because the Ottomans wanted to attract French merchants to the east in order to keep Mediterranean trade alive and break the monopoly of Venetian and Genoese traders. The capitulation served as a tool for this purpose. Over the next 2 centuries, the Ottomans granted these privileges to nearly every European power: England, the Netherlands, Austria. So what did this fundamentally mean? A foreign merchant trading on Ottoman soil did not pay taxes to the state, was not subject to Ottoman courts, lived by the rules of his own country, on someone else's land, and Ottoman merchants, they paid full taxes, were under full oversight, had to compete against rivals with every conceivable advantage. This was not free trade. It was a game in which the rules had been tampered with in advance, and the Ottomans had accepted those rules with their own hands. By the 1700s, local production was already struggling to survive. Weavers, craftsmen, small producers, they had become unable to compete. The empire's own markets were slowly being invaded, not by war, but by trade. Meanwhile, the treasury was melting away. Wars are costly. The empire's borders had expanded too far, and governing them had become increasingly difficult. So the government did what desperate governments have always done throughout history. It began quietly reducing the silver content of coins. The silver content of the akçe, the empire's basic currency, eroded by roughly 90% from the 1500s to the late 1600s. People understood this, of course they did. If you're aware that your money loses value every year, you don't try to hold on to it. Inflation skyrocketed. Soldiers began receiving wages not even sufficient to buy a handful of wheat. The Janissaries, the elite units of the Ottoman army, revolted over unpaid and devalued salaries. By the end of the century, the empire was also grappling with chronic inflation, a discontented army, and a treasury unable to cover its own expenses. The financial cracks were turning into chasms. Then came 1838, and this was a true turning point. Britain, which had emerged strengthened from the Napoleonic Wars, had become an industrial giant. It needed markets for the goods it produced, and that market was, of course, the Ottoman market. The Treaty of Balta Liman looked like a trade agreement on paper, but let us examine the details. The tax applied to British goods entering the Ottoman Empire was 3%. The tax applied to Ottoman merchants selling in that same market, higher than their British rivals. Think about it again. An Ottoman merchant on his own soil in the same market paid more tax than a British merchant. They had become foreigners in their own land. The treaty also abolished state monopolies, the last economic levers the empire held for protecting domestic production dissolved away. The consequences were both immediate and crushing. Local textile production collapsed. Workshops that had operated for generations closed down. The Anatolian weaving industry, which had supplied fabric to the region for centuries, was effectively wiped out within a few decades. Economic historians have given this a precise name: deindustrialization before industrialization. the empire's productive base was shattered before it even had the chance to modernize. And in 1854, the Crimean War broke out. The Ottomans fought alongside Britain and France against Russia. They won on the battlefield, but the war required money they didn't have. So they borrowed. For the first time in the empire's history, the Ottoman government took out foreign loans from European banks, £3 million. That moment was thought of as a solution. In reality, it was the beginning of the end. Because once you begin borrowing, stopping is harder than fighting 10 countries at once, especially if the underlying economy has rotted away. One debt gave birth to the next, then another. Infrastructure projects, military expenditures, and most importantly, paying the interest on old debts with new ones. By 1875, total Ottoman foreign debt had surpassed £200 million. To put that in perspective, this figure was roughly 10 times the empire's annual revenue, 10 years of income, taken on as debt, and most of it had already been spent. In 1875, the Ottoman government did something almost no empire had done before. It declared it could not pay its debts. The official announcement stated that interest payments would be halved. European investors who had purchased Ottoman bonds, ordinary people, suddenly lost 50% of their returns. The reaction grew like an avalanche. Ottoman bonds collapsed. Credit dried up entirely. The empire was effectively expelled from international financial markets. Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed. 2 sultans were replaced within a single year. The financial crisis turned into political collapse. The empire was melting away, and the creditors were in close pursuit. 6 years later, in 1881, a new agreement was signed. It was called the Duyun-u-Umumiye, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This meant a board managed by European creditors granted the authority to collect Ottoman revenues directly, not advisory, not supervisory, collection. The tobacco monopoly transferred. Salt revenues transferred. Silk taxes, alcohol taxes, stamp revenues, fishing fees, all of it flowed directly to this institution before the Ottoman government could lay hands on a single penny. At its peak, this administration employed more than 5,000 people on Ottoman soil. It had its own bureaucracy, its own infrastructure, its own authority. Think about what this means. In your own home, someone else collected the rent and said, "Here, the rest is yours." If there was anything left, that is. The Ottoman Empire had not been conquered, but it had unquestionably lost something more fundamental, its financial sovereignty. It could not even decide where its own money would go. As the new century approached, the empire had entered a path from which there was no return. Collapse was inevitable. The capitulations had rendered it unable to protect its own markets, and the debt administration had rendered it unable to control its own revenues. As if that were not enough, wars continued without end. The Balkan Wars, then the First World War, each consuming whatever remained. The alliance forged with Germany was not merely a strategic decision. It was partly a financial one as well. Germany was offering credit, and at that time, the empire had no choice but to seize every opportunity to generate a source of funds. Throughout the war, Anatolia's agricultural population was armed and sent off to fight. Fields went unplanted. There was no harvest. Between 1916 and 1918, famine struck Anatolia and Syria, and hundreds of thousands of civilians perished. Inflation skyrocketed once again. In some regions, prices reached unimaginable levels. The market devoured basic goods. When the war ended in 1918, there was nothing left to salvage. Now let us step back and ask, were these decisions foolish? No. The capitulations were rational diplomatic tools for their time. The first loan was a necessary step forced by the conditions of war. Every step had a reasonable justification at the time, but each concession made accepting the next one easier, each loan made refusing the next one harder. And when the full picture became clear, when it was understood that the empire had surrendered its economic sovereignty piece by piece, it was too late to turn back. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse because of a single enemy or a single mistake. It was hollowed out, financially, slowly, over generations, through decisions that each appeared manageable at the time, until they no longer were. Even after the empire collapsed and passed into history, the debt lived on. The young Republic of Turkey carried this chain, inherited from its founders, until 1954. And perhaps that is the one thing that stays with you from this story, because this was not the last example. If you found answers to your questions, wonderful. Keep listening to Wallet Historian, and I'll keep searching for answers.